The Tokugawa District Archive contains a dispatch log entry dated the 21st day of the 11th month in the 12th year of Genroku, 1699 by the Western calendar, which records the following. A squad of 12 garrison samurai was dispatched to the mountain settlement of Kaminoda on the 15th to investigate the disappearance of 43 registered inhabitants. The squad returned on the 19th. 3 members reported. 9 were classified as incapacitated due to exposure. Cause of settlement loss, probable bandit activity. Case status, closed. Recommended action, none. Every word of that entry is accurate. Every word of it is a lie. I know because I wrote it. I sat in the Tokugawa office on the morning of the 21st with my brush in my hand and the official form in front of me, and I wrote probable bandit activity because there was no column on the form for what actually happened. There was no vocabulary in the administrative system of the Tokugawa shogunate for what I saw on that mountain. So I used the vocabulary that existed, and I filed a document that will sit in that archive until the building burns or the empire falls. And it will be wrong for every day of its existence. 12 men went up, 12 came down. The 9 listed as incapacitated due to exposure were not incapacitated by exposure. They were emptied. Something on that mountain looked at them and found them insufficient for what it needed, and it set them aside the way a carpenter sets aside wood that will not hold a joint. They were wrong-grained. I was not. Not because I was stronger or braver or more worthy. Because I could read. Because I could count. Because when I held a piece of wood in my hands, I could feel whether the hands that shaped it knew what they were doing. The thing on that mountain knew what it was doing. It had been doing it for longer than the village had existed, longer than the province had been named, longer than the empire that sent me had been governing. And on the morning of the 18th day of the 11th month, in a clearing where a village had been carefully and precisely taken apart, it put a piece of blank wood on the ground between us and waited for someone to pick it up. I was the one who picked it up. I have held it for 58 years. My hands have never been warm since. Or perhaps they have never been cold. I cannot tell the difference anymore. On the 15th day of the 11th month, in the 12th year of Genroku, we left the Tokugawa garrison before dawn. There were 12 of us, and I will name the ones who mattered to this account, and leave the rest to the archive, where their names sit in a box no one has opened in 58 years. The air that morning held the particular stillness of late autumn in the Hida Mountains, the cedars locked in frost, the ground hard enough to ring under a sandal, the sky a flat gray sheet that promised snow but had not yet delivered it. The Tokugawa Valley behind us was still in darkness as we climbed the first switchback of the ridge road, and the torches at the head and rear of the column threw our shadows sideways across the trail in shapes that looked like men walking in a direction none of us were going. I remember this detail because I was trained to notice discrepancies between what a thing is and what a thing appears to be, and because that skill, which had been useless for the first 23 years of my life, turned out to be the reason I survived. I carried the squad's writing kit in a lacquered box strapped across my back, along with 20 sheets of mulberry paper, 2 full inkstones, 3 brushes of descending quality, and a bundle of dried provisions that the quartermaster had weighed at 6 days' supply for 1 man. I also carried a sword I had drawn exactly once in 2 years, during a training exercise in which I had been corrected 4 times by the instructor and once by a 12-year-old page who had been watching from the courtyard wall with an expression I prefer not to recall. My name is Ishikawa. I do not use my given name because it was never important to anyone in this account, including me. I was 23 years old. I had been a tax assessor's apprentice in the Tokugawa civil office for 2 years before the Hida domain was dissolved in 1692 and placed under direct shogunate control, at which point the civilian administrative staff was absorbed into the military garrison, given swords, and reclassified as samurai. This was a bureaucratic convenience, not a reflection of martial capability. Of the 12 men in the column that morning, At least 8 had received their swords the same way I had not, through training, not through lineage, but through a jurisdictional transfer that needed bodies in armor more than it needed men who knew what to do in it. I could copy a tax ledger in 3 hands, formal, running, and grass script. I could inventory a granary in under an hour, with an error rate below 2%. I could calculate rice yields from acreage reports with a speed that had once drawn a compliment from the district assessor, which remained the highest professional praise I had ever received. I could not fight. No one in the squad expected me to fight. I was there because the dispatch required a written report upon return, and I was the man who wrote things. The squad leader was Ogata, 41 years old, a genuine peacetime samurai who had trained in swordsmanship since the age of 9 and had never used it outside a practice hall. This was not unusual. The Genroku period was the longest stretch of sustained peace the country had known in centuries. And men like Ogata, rigorously trained, technically proficient, and entirely untested, were the standard product of the system. He was competent, quiet, and precise in his movements, and he operated on the assumption that every problem was a version of a problem he had already been trained to solve. He had been briefed that Kaminoda had gone silent. No tax submission for the autumn quarter, no smoke visible from the Ridge Road, no response to the district runner sent on the 9th of the month. The runner had returned after reaching the village perimeter and finding it empty, and his report had been filed with the notation probable bandit activity. And Ogata accepted this without question because bandit activity was a category his training contained, a category with procedures, with precedents, with an expected shape. He walked at the front of the column with his hand resting on his sword and his eyes steady on the trail and the absolute confidence of a man whose map matches his terrain. The second in command was Fujiwara, 36, a former rice merchant's clerk who had received his sword the same year I received mine and wore it with the same visible discomfort. Fujiwara was intelligent in the specific way that merchants' clerks are intelligent. He could assess the value of a thing at a glance and dismiss what fell below his threshold of relevance. He dismissed most things. Behind them walked 10 men, whose names I recorded in my field notes, and whose biographies I will not reproduce here, because most of those biographies ended on the 18th day of the 11th month, and the men who lived past that date do not remember having them. We followed the Ridge Road north from Takayama for 3 hours, climbing through cedar forest that thinned as the altitude increased, the trunks growing sparser and the canopy opening in patches that let the gray sky through like light through threadbare cloth. The Ridge Road was a shogunate-maintained route, packed earth, engineered drainage, width sufficient for a supply cart, and it bore the evidence of regular traffic. Then we turned east onto the spur trail that climbed toward the Kaminoda Valley, and the evidence stopped. The spur trail was well maintained for its first 2,000 paces. Packed earth, cleared brush on both shoulders, drainage cuts at regular intervals, angled to channel runoff away from the walking surface. The work was competent, not military grade, but consistent with a village maintaining its access route to the district road as required by the settlement charter. Then it was not. The transition was not gradual. It was a line. On one side, a trail maintained by human labor on a seasonal schedule. On the other, 7 years of growth swallowing the path from both edges, ferns at knee height, saplings as thick as a man's thumb pushing through the packed earth, drainage cuts silted shut and overflowing into the trail bed. I stopped at the transition line and noted it in my record because I noted everything, and because the change was too clean to be natural. Maintenance had not declined. It had ceased at a specific point, at a specific time. Someone had maintained this trail up to a precise date and then never touched it again. I did not yet know the date. I would learn it in the shrine. We reached the village of Kaminoda by midday. The village was visible from the ridge above it. 200 vertical meters up, or rather, the space where the village should have been was visible. I want to be precise about what I mean. The clearing was there. The footprint of the settlement, the leveled ground, the post holes, the stone foundations, arranged in the standard mountain village pattern of concentric rings around a central shrine was there. The shrine itself was there, intact. Its cedar pillars still vertical, its offering shelf still level, its roof still shedding the morning's frost in thin runnels of meltwater. But the village itself, the 43-person, 19-structure settlement that had filed tax returns for 61 consecutive years and maintained a spur trail to the Ridge Road and submitted quarterly rice assessments to the Takayama office in a hand I had personally cataloged, was gone. Not burned, not collapsed, not scattered by storm or shaken down by earthquake. Removed, taken apart, and carried away, leaving behind only the stone foundations that could not be carried and the shrine that, for reasons I did not yet understand, had not been touched. Ogata halted the column at the edge of the clearing and studied the site for a full minute without speaking. I watched his eyes move from foundation to foundation, assessing, categorizing, fitting what he saw into the framework he carried. Then he said, "Bandits. They stripped it for materials and drove the population east. We'll find them in the next valley." He said this the way a man places a roof beam, settling it into the slot where it was always meant to go, where the engineering required it to go. The explanation fit. The explanation was wrong. But I did not know it was wrong yet. I knew only that I had been assigned to inventory what we found. And what we found was an absence shaped exactly like a village. And absences, in my experience, have edges. And edges can be measured. And I intended to measure them. I began my inventory on the afternoon of the 15th, starting at the northeastern corner of the clearing where the outermost storage structure had stood. Its foundation stones remained river rock, hand-placed, level to within a finger's width, arranged in the rectangular footprint of a standard mountain storehouse. The post holes were open, clean-edged, without the splintering or tearing that accompanies a post being broken off at the base or pulled sideways by draft animals. These posts had been lifted, straight up, out of their holes, the way a carpenter lifts a post during controlled disassembly when he intends to reuse the timber. The socket walls were smooth. Not a single stone in the foundation had shifted from its original placement. I moved to the next structure. The same, and the next. The same. I moved inward through the settlement's concentric ring storage buildings on the outer ring, residences on the second ring, the headman's house and communal structures on the inner ring. The shrine at the center and at each foundation, I recorded the same evidence. Posts lifted cleanly, sockets intact, foundation stones undisturbed. By the time I had surveyed 7 foundations, I had begun to count not just what was missing, but what was present. And what was present made no sense under any theory that included bandits. Wooden pegs, dozens of them, laid in neat rows beside each foundation, sorted by size, organized by structural position. These were the pegs that adjoined the beams, the critical connective hardware of traditional post and beam construction. In a building that collapses, pegs snap under shear stress. In a building that burns, pegs are consumed with the timber they hold. In a building stripped by raiders, pegs are carried off inside the joints they connect, because no raiding party in the history of Hida Province has ever stopped mid-theft to disassemble a joint, extract the peg, and lay it neatly on the ground beside the foundation it came from. Yet here they were, rows of pegs, intact, undamaged, organized by function. I knelt beside the nearest row and picked one up. The shaft was smooth, the taper intact, the head unbattered. I held it to the light and turned it slowly, examining the extraction the end that sits inside the joint and bears the friction load. No tool marks. None. When a peg is driven out with a mallet or a lever, the wood compresses at the point of contact. You can see the impact signature, the bruising of the grain, the slight mushrooming of the wood fiber where the tool struck. I have examined pegs extracted by professional carpenters during building demolitions. The marks are always there. These pegs had none. They had been pulled straight out of cured post and beam joints by grip alone. Something had held the beam steady with one hand and drawn the peg with the other, the way a man pulls a stopper from a flask. The force required to extract a structural peg from a cured hinoki joint without tools is beyond any human hand I have ever measured. And by that point in my career, I had measured many. I had inventoried 14 building demolitions in the Takayama district, and I knew what human hands left behind when they did this work. The grip needed to perform this extraction would have to span the full width of a peg head, roughly 3 fingers, and generate enough sustained, linear force to overcome the friction of cured cypress against cured cypress without lateral deviation. A human hand cannot do this. A human hand with a tool leaves marks. These pegs bore no marks of any kind. I examined 11 more, all identical. No tool impressions, no impact compression, no lateral scarring. Pulled clean by something that gripped and drew in a single motion. I reported this to Ogata. He listened, looked at the pegs I had arranged on a cloth for display, and said, "Large men, a bandit crew with strong hands and experience dismantling structures for timber." Fujiwara nodded. I did not argue. I had learned in the tax office that arguing with a superior's assessment before assembling sufficient counter-evidence was a waste of institutional capital I did not have. I wrote Ogata's assessment in the margin of my inventory. Squad leader attributes extraction to bandit crew with demolition experience. And beside it, in smaller characters, I wrote, "No tool marks, no drag ruts, no cart tracks anywhere in the clearing, pegs sorted by size and structural position, structures removed in sequence outermost first, innermost last, shrine untouched. Whoever did this worked inward from the edges of the settlement, structure by structure, in the reverse order of the settlement's construction chronology. The last building built was the first taken down. The first building built was the last. The shrine, which predates the settlement itself, was not touched." I did not yet understand the significance of that sequence. I understood only that whoever had done this possessed hands of extraordinary capability. Hands that could grip cured hardwood and extract tight-fitted pegs without tools, without leverage, without leaving a single mark on the wood. Hands that worked with a precision that suggested not just strength, but knowledge. An understanding of how the joints functioned, how the load transferred, which peg to pull first to allow the beam above it to be lowered without collapsing the adjacent structure. Hands that were not human. I did not write this conclusion. I thought it, Neen, and I set it aside the way I had been trained to set aside conclusions that lacked sufficient evidence. But the thought remained, the way a vibration remains in wood after the sound that produced it has stopped. The villagers' belongings told a second story. Inside the shrine, the only standing structure, personal items, had been stacked with care. Clothing folded. Cooking implements nested inside each other. Children's sandals paired and aligned by size, smallest to largest. Rice bowls stacked. Sewing kits bundled. 43 people's portable possessions, organized by household, arranged on the shrine floor in a spatial pattern I recognized only after I had been staring at it for 10 minutes. The arrangement matched the village layout. Household 1's belongings were placed on the shrine floor at the position corresponding to Household 1's location in the settlement. Household 19's belongings were placed at the position corresponding to Household 19's location. The shrine floor was a map of the village, rendered in personal effects. A catalog, a filing system. Whoever had disassembled the village had separated the structures from their contents, with the care of an archivist separating documents from their bindings, and had filed both in their correct positions. This was not banditry. I stood in that shrine looking at the paired children's sandals and the folded clothing, and I felt the first true chill of the investigation, not the chill of danger, but the chill of recognition. I was looking at the work of something that organized information, something that kept records, something that understood the difference between a structure and the people who lived in it, and had taken the trouble to separate and catalog both. I found the footprints on the morning of the 16th, in the soft ground behind the shrine where the frost had not yet reached. 43 sets of human footprints, walking in a single file toward the eastern tree line. The prints were evenly spaced at a stride length of approximately 50 centimeters, a measured, unhurried pace, consistent with neither flight nor forced march. No running, no stumbling, no shortened stride that would indicate a child being carried. No dragging furrow that would indicate an elder being pulled. Every person in the village, including the children, had walked out at the same measured pace, in the same direction, at what the frost pattern suggested was the same hour, as though following a rhythm only they could hear. Beside the human prints, parallel to them but offset by 2 meters to the north, was a second track, a single set of prints, bipedal, pressed into the frozen ground to a depth that I measured 3 times to confirm, 4 centimeters. Human footprints in the same soil at the same moisture content registered 1 centimeter at most. Whatever had made these prints exerted 4 times the ground pressure of a full-grown man, walked upright for a continuous distance of 400 meters in a straight line, and had feet measuring 62 centimeters in length and 24 centimeters in width at the ball. I measured these dimensions with the same folding rule I used for building foundations. I measured them because measuring was the only response my training had equipped me with. When a man does not know what to do, he does what he knows. Ogata looked at the prints and said, "Bear." I did not say what I was thinking, which was that no bear in the Hida Mountains walks bipedally for 400 continuous meters in a ruled straight line beside a column of 43 cooperative humans. I wrote bear per squad leader's assessment in my notes. Below it, I wrote the measurements and added nothing further. The measurements spoke for themselves to anyone who was willing to listen. On the morning of the 16th, a man came out of the eastern tree line. He walked toward us across the clearing with the unhurried gait of someone who has been walking mountain terrain since before he could remember, and who measures distance not in units, but in effort the rolling, slightly bow-legged stride of a life spent on grades too steep for flat-footed walking. He was old, 60 at least, possibly older the mountain people of Hida age, in a way that compresses the decades between 50 and 70 into a single weathered surface. And I could not place him more precisely than that. He had the compressed posture and oversized hands of a man who had spent his life working timber shoulders rounded forward from decades of axe work, forearms thicker than his upper arms, fingers permanently curved into the ghost of a grip. He wore a woodcutter's jacket over layered hemp and straw sandals that had been retied so many times the knot at the ankle was the size of a child's fist. He carried no weapon. He stopped at the edge of the clearing, not at the edge of the village's footprint, which is where a visitor would stop, but at the edge of the clearing itself, as though the relevant boundary was not the settlement, but the open ground. And he waited for Ogata to address him before he spoke. His name was Ueda. He was a timber cutter from the Minamidani Valley, one drainage to the south of Kaminoda, where his family had been cutting timber for 4 generations. He had been coming to check on Kaminoda every few weeks since the autumn silence began, he said. And he said this with the tone of a man describing a professional routine rather than a personal concern, the way a night watchman describes checking a door. He came because a silent village in these mountains meant one of 2 things, and he needed to know which one. Ogata asked him what 2 things. Ueda looked at the cleared foundations. He looked at the sorted pegs. He looked at the shrine standing alone in the center of its emptied settlement. Then he looked at Ogata and said, "Either everyone left or the landlord came." The word he used was jinushi, landlord, landowner, the one who holds the ground. Ogata asked him what he meant. Ueda did not hurry his answer. He looked at the clearing again, as though confirming something he already knew, and said, "The one who was here before the village, the one who owns the clearing." My grandfather maintained paths for it. My father maintained waterways. The village was supposed to do the same. They were given the terms when the settlement was founded. They kept the terms for 60 years. Then the headman who knew the terms died, and the new headman did not know them, and the village stopped doing the work. He paused. That was 7 years ago. Fujiwara stepped forward. Old man, the Tokugawa shogunate does not recognize territorial claims by mountain spirits. This is a criminal investigation under district authority. If you have information about the bandits who stripped this settlement— There are no bandits, Ueda said. He said it without raising his voice, without turning to look at Fujiwara, without any of the defensive urgency that accompanies a man who expects to be disbelieved. He said it the way he would say, "There is no rain today." A statement of observable condition, not an argument. Then he looked at me, not at Ogata, not at Fujiwara, at me, at the writing kit on my back, at the ink stains on my fingers, at the brush I'd been using to record measurements in the clearing, and he said, "You are the one who writes things." It was not a question. I confirmed it anyway. "Then come with me to the shrine," he said. "There are things inside that you will understand, and they will not." Ogata could have refused. He could have detained Ueda as a material witness, or dismissed him as a superstitious woodcutter contaminating a criminal scene. He did neither. He looked at Ueda for a long moment, the old man's calm, his unsurprised assessment of the village's condition, the professional steadiness of his bearing, and said, "Show us. I have thought about this decision for 58 years. I believe Ogata had already begun to feel the shape of something his categories could not hold, and the timber cutter's calm was more credible than any framework Ogata had brought with him from Takayama. Ueda was not performing the role of the frightened local or the cryptic elder. He was a man who had been monitoring a situation he understood and was now briefing the first official responders to arrive. The briefing had the quality of a professional handoff, one jurisdictional authority informing another. We walked to the shrine. On the way, it was not a long walk. Perhaps 60 paces from the clearing's edge to the shrine steps, Ueda spoke about the creature with a practicality that I found more unsettling than any description of savagery could have been. He called it the landlord. Not a spirit, not a god, not a monster. The landlord. He said it had lived in the upper mountain for as long as his family had records, 4 generations of direct knowledge, an oral tradition stretching further back than that into a period no one could date. He said it was large, very large, taller than any man by a full body length. He said it walked upright, always, the way a man walks. But it was not a man. He said it maintained the upper mountain, the terrain above the tree line, and the high waterways, and the slopes too steep for human access, the way a farmer maintains his fields. Clearing deadfall, managing water flow, moving rockfall, keeping certain paths open through the high country for purposes Ueda could not fully explain, but that his family had always understood to be related to the mountain's own cycles of water and season and growth. He said the arrangement was old and simple. The creature maintained what humans could not reach. The humans maintained what the creature's hands were too large to manage with precision. The low paths, the drainage channels, the small gauge waterway work that required tools and fingers that could grip a trowel, the fine work. It works with its hands, Ueda said. Everything it does with its hands. My grandfather watched it repair a waterway once, from a distance of perhaps 50 meters. He said it placed stones the way a mason places stones, deliberate, checking the fit, adjusting. But its hands are the size of a man's torso. It can move a boulder that would take 10 men with levers. It cannot thread a drainage channel with gravel. He looked at his own hands, the timber cutter's hands, thick and scarred and capable. That is what we were for. That is what the village was for. The fine work. I wrote this down. All of it. Every word. Fujiwara made a sound that was not quite a laugh. Ogata said nothing, but he did not tell Ueda to stop. And that silence, that failure to dismiss, was the first crack in the framework he had carried up the mountain. The shrine was 8 mats in size, cedar posted, with a single room and an offering shelf that faced the mountain. The construction was older than the village. I could see this in the timber, which was larger diameter and darker aged than any of the structural lumber in the village foundations, and in the joinery, which used a mortise and tenon style that predated the settlement period by at least 2 generations. This shrine had been here before the village was built around it. It was part of the original infrastructure, part of the landlord's infrastructure. The offerings on the shelf had been accepted. 3 ceramic bowls, emptied and placed back in their positions, their interiors cleaned by something wider than a human tongue. I could see the scrape pattern on the glaze, a single broad stroke from rim to center, repeated in each bowl. A stick of incense burned to its base. A folded cloth, untouched. Whatever had visited this shrine had eaten what was offered, burned what was lit for it, and left what did not interest it. The visits were recent. The bowl residue was soft, not dried. Something had been here within the week. Below the offering shelf, in a cedar box that had been built into the shrine's foundation, I found the boards. There were 14 of them. Hinoki cypress, each the length of a man's forearm, each sanded to a writing surface on one face. The sanding was remarkable, the grain compressed in long parallel strokes that ran the full length of the board, the surface as smooth as any paper I had worked on in the Tokugawa office. The edges chamfered at consistent angles with a regularity that implied either a very fine plane or sustained pressure from a very steady hand. No plane marks, no chisel signatures, no blade kerf anywhere on the boards. The sanding had been done by hand, by direct palm pressure applied in repeated strokes across the grain, and the compression pattern told me the palm was at least twice the width of mine. The inscriptions on the boards were not literary Japanese. They were a simplified notation, seasonal markers rendered as pictographic shorthand, task descriptions written in a reduced character set that used perhaps 40 distinct symbols, locations identified by landmark rather than administrative name. The characters were carved, not brushed, and each character had been produced in a single pass, not the multiple careful strokes of a trained calligrapher, but a single continuous cut, deep and even, executed with a tool I could not identify, or with a fingernail harder and sharper and more precisely controlled than any I have encountered in a human hand. The carving depth was consistent across entries that spanned decades. The same hand had made all of them. I read them in order. 2nd month. Clear the eastern path from the Twin Falls to the Split Cedar. Below this, a completion mark, a single horizontal score in a different hand, lighter, shallower, made with a brush tip rather than a carving tool. A human confirmation. 4th month. Open the upper channel before snowmelt. Completion mark. 6th month. Clear deadfall from the western drainage, 300 paces above the mossy stone. Completion mark. The entries continued in this pattern across all 14 boards, spanning what I estimated to be 70 years of seasonal maintenance records. Each board covered approximately 5 years. Each year contained the same tasks in the same sequence, adjusted for conditions, a note about unusually heavy snowfall in one year, a collapsed section of the western drainage in another, an additional task added in what I calculated to be the 32nd year of the record when a new path was apparently opened through the upper forest and added to the maintenance schedule. The task entries, the carved ones, were identical in hand across the entire 70-year span. The same grip, the same pressure, the same single-stroke technique, the same non-human hand, writing in a notation system it had either learned or invented. For 70 years without interruption. I looked at the grip marks on the edges of the boards where the carver had held them steady during inscription. The compression pattern was unmistakable. 4 fingers on one side and a posed thumb on the other. The grip spanning the full width of the board, 12 centimeters. My hand, when I placed it over the mark, covered less than half the grip's width. The fingers that had made these marks were each as wide as two of mine placed side by side. "These are not prayers," I said. One of the samurai behind me, I do not remember which, said, "Of course they are. This is a mountain shrine. Those are ritual inscription boards." I held up the fourth board and pointed to the entry for the 6th month. "Prayers do not include drainage specifications," I said. "This line describes a specific waterway clearance task at a specific landmark 300 paces above a mossy stone with a seasonal deadline. These are work orders, maintenance schedules, written by one hand and confirmed by another. The writing hand is not human. The confirming hand is." Ueda, standing in the shrine doorway with the gray light behind him, nodded once. "The landlord writes the list. The village does the work. The village marks it done. That has been the arrangement since before my grandfather's time, since before anyone's time." I turned to the final board, the most recent. The task entries continued in the same carved hand, the same depth, the same single-stroke precision. Spring tasks, autumn tasks, winter preparations. The creature had continued writing the seasonal work orders on schedule without interruption. But the completion marks, the human confirmations, stopped. The last confirmed task was dated to a seasonal marker I calculated as corresponding to 7 years before our arrival. The autumn of the year, the village headman died. After that entry, the creature's task listings continued. It had carved new work orders each season for 7 years, specifying the paths to be cleared, the channels to be opened, the deadfall to be removed, but beneath each task, the space reserved for the human completion mark was empty. No one had confirmed. No one had done the work. For 7 years, the landlord had been writing instructions on the boards, and no one had been reading them. Below the last unconfirmed task entry, the board bore 7 marks of a different kind. Not carved characters, not seasonal notations. Scratches. 7 vertical scores, grouped by year, cut deeper than the task entries and with less control. The carving tool, the same fingernail or claw that had produced 70 years of steady, precise inscriptions, had here produced marks that were rougher, more variable, pressed into the wood with a force that suggested not just recording but feeling. The first scratch was deep and controlled, nearly as precise as the task entries. The second was slightly rougher. By the 7th, the line was uneven, the depth inconsistent, the edges ragged. I touched the 7th mark. The wood beneath my fingertip hummed a vibration so low it registered not as sound, but as pressure, as though the board itself were still resonating with the force of the hand that had scored it. I pressed my palm flat against the surface and felt it pulse. Once, twice, a rhythm too slow and too deep for the wood alone to produce. The board was warm under my hand. Not the warmth of the afternoon. The shrine was shaded and cool. A different warmth, the warmth of contact, as though the hand that had carved these marks had been here recently enough that its heat had not yet left the grain. 7 scratches, 1 per year. The creature had kept count of the silence on the village's own boards. It had filed its annual complaints in the only shared medium that existed between its administration and theirs. And the deterioration of the marks across the 7 years told me something the creature could not have intended to communicate, but that I, as a man who had spent his professional life examining the marks that hands leave on documents, could not fail to read. The creature's hand had been steady when doing its regular work. The task entries carved during the same 7 years were as precise as ever, but it shook when recording the silence. The steadiness failed only when the subject was the failure of the arrangement. I stood in that shrine holding the board, and I understood 3 things simultaneously. First, the creature was real, and it was literate in a notation system it had maintained for longer than any human document in the Tokugawa archive. Second, it had waited 7 years filing annual notices of default into an office no one was staffing, before it came to the door in person. Third, the 7 scratches were not anger. They were something I recognized because I had seen it in my own hand, on nights when I copied reports that no one would read into ledgers that no one would open. The scratches were the marks of something that was afraid the arrangement was over. I wrote the number 7 in my notes. I underlined it. Then I wrote beneath it, 7 winters asking. Then it came to collect. We entered the forest at first light on the 17th, following the path described on the second board, the eastern route from the Twin Falls to the Split Cedar. Hida led. I carried the shrine boards in my pack, wrapped in cloth against my back, because I could not bring myself to leave them in the shrine, where they had gone unread for 7 years, and because their weight against my spine felt like something I'd been assigned to carry not by Ogata, not by the garrison, but by the boards themselves, which had been waiting for a reader the way a letter waits for the hand it was addressed to. The morning was cold and still. Frost had sealed the upper canopy into a lattice of white that filtered the early light into a pale, directionless glow, and our breath hung in the air in columns that dispersed slowly, as though the atmosphere itself was thicker here than it had been in the valley. The forest was old-growth hinoki and suge cypress and cedar, with trunk diameters I estimated at 4 to 6 meters for the largest specimens, the bark furrowed into vertical channels deep enough to fit my forearm. These trees were older than the village, older than the shrine, older, perhaps, than the arrangement itself, though I had no way to confirm this. And confirmation was not something the forest was offering. The path was legible for its first 300 paces. The grade had been cut into the slope at a consistent angle. The drainage channels were still visible beneath the overgrowth, and the width of the original clearing was marked by the age difference between the trees on either side. A maintained path creates a light gap, and the trees that grow in that gap are younger than the trees on either side, and that age difference persists for decades after maintenance stops. I could read the path's history in the tree rings if I had the tools, but I did not need them. The evidence was on the surface. 7 years of neglect. Ferns at knee height reclaiming both shoulders. Young saplings pushing through the packed earth at the center. A drainage culvert 200 paces in had silted shut and spilled its runoff across the path, in a broad fan of moss and standing water that we had to wade through calf deep. I checked this against the boards as we walked. The second board specified eastern path, 1st month and 6th month. Clear growth to 2 arm widths. Clear drainage of debris. Confirmed annually for 63 consecutive years. Then silence. What I had not expected, what no framework I carried from Takayama had prepared me for, was the other maintenance. Past the silted culvert, the overgrowth was not uniform. On the left side of the path, vegetation had advanced unchecked ferns and saplings of consistent age, representing 7 full growing seasons of reclamation. On the right side, the growth was different, younger, thinner. Some sections had been cleared as recently as the previous season, the cut surfaces still pale where the wood had not yet weathered. But the clearing was wrong. Branches had been snapped rather than cut, broken at a height of approximately 2.5 meters far above where a man with a hand tool would work, at the exact height where a hand reaching down from a standing height of 3 meters would naturally make contact. Saplings had been pulled rather than chopped, their root balls torn from the soil in craters that matched the span of a grip wider than both my hands placed side by side. And the drainage channel on the right side had been scratched open with something that was not a trowel. A broad, blunt instrument that had gouged the channel wider and deeper than the original specifications, destabilizing the banks and undermining the stone lining that had been carefully placed by human hands 60 years earlier. The creature had been maintaining the path itself. For 7 years, after the village stopped doing the work, the creature had come down to the low paths, the paths that the arrangement specified as human responsibility, and attempted to do the maintenance with its own hands. Hands that were built for gripping timber and shaping boulders and moving deadfall, not for the fine gauge work the contract specified. The result was visible everywhere I looked. A path half maintained by an intelligence that understood what needed doing, but whose anatomy could not do it at the required scale. The branches were cleared, but cleared too high, leaving a corridor passable for something 3 meters tall, but still obstructed at human height. The drainage was opened, but gouged too wide. The precision of the original channel work replaced by rough trenching that moved water, but damaged the infrastructure. The saplings were removed, but the ground was torn rather than smoothed, cratered where root balls had been extracted by brute grip rather than careful digging. Hida walked beside me and pointed at the evidence without surprise. "It has been doing this since the village stopped," he said. "Every spring, every autumn. It walks the paths described on the boards and does what it can. It cannot do all of it. The fine work, the channel shaping, the culvert clearing, the surface grading, the stone lining repair that was always the human part. The landlord handles the large-scale work, the things that require mass, deadfall, rock slides, fallen trees across the upper waterways. It is not designed to work alone. Nothing that built this arrangement was designed to work alone. That was the whole point." We continued up the path. I checked each section against the boards. Every failure I could see on the ground had a corresponding task entry in the maintenance logs, a task that had been listed, left unconfirmed, and then crudely attempted by hands too large for the job. The evidence was not of menace. It was of effort. The creature had been trying. For 7 years, it had been trying to hold the arrangement together by itself, and the trying was destroying the infrastructure faster than the neglect would have. At approximately the 5th hour of the march, I became aware that we were no longer alone on the path. The awareness did not arrive through any single sense. It arrived through all of them simultaneously, at a level below conscious registration, the way you become aware of a change in barometric pressure before the storm is visible. The air changed weight, not temperature weight. Something massive was displacing atmosphere in the canopy above and ahead of us, and the displacement reached us as a faint, continuous pressure on the skin, the way you feel the bow wave of a large vessel before you see the vessel itself. There was a smell, old bark, wet stone, mineral-rich soil, and beneath all three, a warmth, a mammalian warmth that was wrong for the altitude and wrong for the season, the radiant heat signature of a body large enough to create its own thermal microclimate within the forest canopy. And there was sound, not vocalization, not footfall, grip, the sound of something taking hold of a branch in the canopy above us, the creak of wood bearing a sudden immense load, then holding its weight on that grip for the duration of our passage beneath it, then releasing and gripping the next branch ahead. A rhythmic compression grip, hold, release, grip, that tracked our progress from above and maintained a fixed distance. It was pacing us, matching our speed exactly, moving when we moved, stopping when we stopped, as though we were walking a route it had walked 10,000 times, and it was checking our progress against a schedule only it could read. I looked up. The canopy was too dense, the light too filtered by frost and foliage, and I saw nothing that resolved into a shape. But I saw the evidence of what was above us. A branch 30 meters overhead, as thick as my thigh, bending slowly under a sustained weight that no arboreal animal in these mountains could produce. Not a bear, not a cerro, not any creature on the regional fauna lists I had cataloged in the Tokugawa office. The branch bent and held. Whatever stood on it was standing still, watching us pass beneath. I saw bark on a cedar trunk at the 5-meter mark, scored with parallel compression lines, 4 lines, evenly spaced, consistent with 4 fingers closing around the trunk and bearing a body's full weight. The grip marks were fresh. The exposed wood beneath the scored bark was still pale, not yet oxidized. And the handprint, because that is what it was, a handprint, as legible as a signature, was 12 inches across at the widest point, 4 fingers and an opposed thumb. I reached up and pressed my own hand against the marks. My palm covered less than half the print. The wood beneath the scored bark was warm. Ogata, ahead of me on the path, had stopped walking. He stood very still with his hand on his sword and his eyes on the canopy and his head tilted at the angle of a man listening to something he cannot locate. "Bear," he said. But he said it quietly, and he said it without turning around. And he said it the way a man says a word he has used too many times in too many situations, and no longer trusts to carry the meaning it once carried. The timber cutter looked at me. I looked at my hand, still pressed against the warm bark, and I wrote in my notes, "Not bears, 12-inch grip span, 4 fingers and opposed thumb, consistent with all prior evidence joinery extraction, board carving, channel gouging. It is above us. It has been above us since we entered the tree line. It is not pursuing, it is pacing. It is walking us along the route described on its own boards." We made camp at the head of the upper waterway as the light failed on the 17th. The waterway was the one described on the 4th board, the upper channel to be opened before snowmelt each spring. It was clogged. 7 years of silt and fallen branches had reduced the channel to a stagnant seep, and the surrounding slope had eroded in deep runnels where the water, denied its designed path, had been forced to find its own way down the mountain. I stood at the head of the ruined waterway and mapped the correspondence between what I saw and what the board described. And the correspondence was exact. This was a named location in the creature's maintenance records, a specific task, a specific failure, a 7-year failure that the creature had been unable to repair because the channel was too narrow for its hands, and the stone lining required a precision of placement that exceeded its anatomy. We were standing at the site of a specific line item in an overdue contract, and the creditor was in the canopy above us. Ogata posted watches and built the fire high. He told the men we were dealing with a large animal, likely a bear or a feral dog pack, and that we would begin our withdrawal at first light. 3 men had already asked to turn back during the afternoon march. Ogata had denied them by authority alone. But I could see in his jaw the tension of a man who was spending authority faster than he was earning it. The framework was failing. The map no longer matched the terrain. And the terrain, I understood now, had never been ours to map. It came at the 2nd watch. I was awake, sitting with my back against a cedar trunk, reviewing my notes by the low amber remnant of the fire. The fire had burned down to a bed of coals that cast a circle of weak visibility, perhaps 8 meters in diameter, and beyond that circle the forest was a wall of black, so dense it had texture, not the open darkness of a clear night, but the packed, layered darkness of old-growth canopy that absorbed light the way deep water absorbs sound. I was tracing the carved characters on the 4th board with my fingertip, matching them to my transcriptions, when the darkness between 2 cedar trunks at the edge of the firelight changed. Something occupied it. I did not see the creature arrive. I did not hear it step into position. I became aware that a section of the darkness that had been empty was now full, that the space between the 2 trunks, which I'd been using as a visual reference point for the past hour, had acquired a density and a vertical dimension it had not previously possessed. The shape was upright. It was taller than either cedar trunk was wide at the base. Its shoulders, if the lateral extent of the shape at approximately 2/3 of its height could be called shoulders, blotted out a section of canopy that I had been using to estimate tree spacing. I lost the reference the way you lose a familiar star, behind a slowly rising mountain gradually, then completely, with the understanding that what is hiding the star is larger than anything you had accounted for. One eye caught the ember light, pale, set forward in the skull like a man's eye, not to the side like a deer's or a dog's. The pupil was visible contracted against even the faint glow of the dying fire. It was looking at me, not at the fire, not at the camp. Not at the 9 other men sleeping or pretending to sleep around the coal bed. At me. At the board in my hands. I stopped breathing. My hands did not stop. They remained on the board, fingers tracing the last character I had been reading, as though the work I was doing had its own momentum, independent of my body's decision to stop participating in respiration. The creature did not move. For a duration I later estimated poorly, because time became unreliable in the creature's presence. At the length of time it takes to boil a full pot of water. It stood at the edge of the firelight and regarded me and the boards I held with an attention I can only describe as professional. It was watching me read its work the way I have seen master carpenters watch apprentices handle their tools, with an intensity that was evaluating not my skill, but my seriousness. I could see nothing of its body except the shape and the eye, and the hands. The hands. They hung at its sides, just inside the edge of the amber light where the glow died into darkness. They were the first part of the creature I saw in detail, and they are the part I have carried longest. Long-fingered, articulate at 3 visible joints. Not paws, not claws, not the blunt terminal instruments of a predatory animal. Hands, each finger as thick as my wrist, curving slightly inward at rest, the nails dark and blunt and worn smooth, the working surface of nails that had spent decades gripping stone, shaping wood, scoring characters into hinoki boards with a precision I could verify because I was holding the proof. The hands were relaxed, open. They hung the way a craftsman's hands hang when he's standing in his workshop, surveying a project not ready to strike, not ready to grasp, simply present, available, waiting to be useful. I looked at those hands, and I knew them. I knew them the way you know a scribe's hand from his brushwork, the way you know a carpenter's hand from his joints. These were the hands that had carved the boards, the same span, the same articulation, the same nail geometry that had produced the single-stroke characters, the same palms that had sanded the writing surfaces smooth. 70 years of craftsmanship, hanging 6 meters from me in the dark, still warm from the work they had been doing that afternoon, maintaining some path, gripping some branch, holding the mountain together with a patience that made my 58 years of subsequent life feel like an interruption in a much longer sentence. Then the creature spoke, not in language, not in any system of organized phonemes I could classify. It produced a vocalization from deep in its chest, a sound I felt in my sternum before I heard it in my ears. A vibration that entered my body through bone conduction and radiated outward through my rib cage and into my arms and down into my hands, where they rested on the board. The sound was rhythmic, patterned, deliberate. It repeated in a sequence that was clearly intentional. 3 pulses, a pause the length of 1 pulse. 2 pulses, a pause. 2 pulses, a pause. Then silence. Then the sequence again. 3, 2, 2, 3, 2, 2. Ueda was awake. He sat upright by the dead fire with his hands on his knees and his eyes on the darkness, and his face set in an expression I can only describe as professional attention. The focused calm of a man listening to a report he has been expecting. He listened through 2 full repetitions of the sequence, and then said quietly, to no one in particular, "It is telling you what needs doing. 7 pulses. Grouped 3, 2, 2. I reached for the boards without taking my eyes off the shape. I laid the 4th board across my knees. I counted the unconfirmed task entries by touch, my fingers finding the carved edges of each character in the dark. The first group, 3 tasks: clear the eastern path, open the upper channel, remove deadfall from the western drainage. The second group, 2 tasks: repair the stone lining at the lower ford, recut the overflow channel at the mossy stone. The third group, 2 tasks: regrade the access path to the upper clearing, maintain the perimeter culverts around the settlement footprint. 7 tasks. 3, 2, 2. The creature was reciting the contract. Not from memory alone, it was reciting it in the same organizational structure as the boards. The same groupings, the same sequence. The vocalization was not a threat, not a territorial declaration, not a warning. It was a formal, structured reading of the delinquent terms of an agreement it had authored and maintained for 70 years, delivered to the first literate human to hold those terms in 7 years of silence. The vocalization ended. The creature stood for another long moment, the eye still on me, the hand still hanging open at its sides. And then it stepped backward into the darkness, with a silence that should have been physically impossible for something of its mass. One moment the shape was there. The next, the darkness between the trunks was empty again, and the canopy reference point I had lost was visible. And the only evidence of its presence was the vibration still humming in the board on my knees, and the warmth slowly fading from the air where it had stood. The camp was silent. No one spoke. Ogata sat with his sword across his knees and his face blank. And I understood in the way you understand a structural failure by the sound it makes that his framework had just broken. Quietly, without protest, the map had departed the terrain so completely that the man holding the map could no longer pretend it had ever matched. The 9 men who would later walk out of the forest empty were all awake, all staring at the space the creature had vacated. And I believe now, 58 years later, that their emptying began in that moment. The creature had shown them a scale their minds could not incorporate, and their minds, unable to expand, had done the only thing available to them. They contracted. They withdrew from their own eyes. The shelf did not collapse. It closed. I did not close. I want to be clear about why, and I want to be clear that the reason is not admirable. It was not courage. It was not spiritual readiness. It was not the quality of my character. I survived because I was reading. My hands were on the boards. My fingers were counting task entries. My mind was matching the grouped pulses to the grouped clauses. I was doing the only work I had ever been trained to do, counting, comparing, transcribing. And the work gave my mind a structure that the creature's presence could not collapse. The shelf held because it had a load to bear. If I'd been standing idle, if I'd been watching without working, I believe I would have emptied with the others. I survived because I was useful at the exact moment when uselessness was fatal. After the camp settled into a silence that was not sleep, I returned to the boards. I re-examined the 7th scratch mark, the most recent, the roughest, the one whose line wavered in a way the others did not. And I understood, with a clarity that arrived not as insight, but as recognition, that the wavering was not rage. The creature's task entry handed its professional hand, its craftsmanship hand, remained steady throughout the 7-year period. I had verified this. The deterioration was confined to the scratch marks, to the complaints. The creature's hand shook only when recording the fact that no one was answering. It was not angry. It was afraid. Afraid the arrangement was over. Afraid that the only collaboration between its existence and ours, the only evidence that 2 species had found a way to share a mountain, was ending. And it had been afraid for 7 years. And it had expressed that fear the only way it knew how. By scratching it into the record, 1 mark per year, in a hand that grew less steady as the silence grew longer. At dawn on the 18th, Ogata gave the order to withdraw. His voice had changed overnight, the clipped, categorical authority of the previous days, replaced by something thinner, a man reading from a text he could no longer fully see. We broke camp in the gray pre-dawn light and began the descent along the same path we had climbed. The creature's half-maintained route passing beneath our feet, in reverse, the gouged drainage channels, the 2 high clearance cuts, the cratered ground where saplings had been torn out by roots. The evidence of 7 years of solitary effort. We reached the village clearing by the middle of the morning. The sky was flat overcast, windless. The mountain air so still that sound carried with a clarity that made every footfall, every breath, every creak of armor feel like a declaration. The shrine stood where it had always stood. The sorted pegs lay in their neat rows. The paired children's sandals waited on the shrine floor. The creature was in the clearing. It stood at the far edge, between the two largest cedar stumps, the post footings of what had been the village headman's house, the last structure removed in the foreclosure sequence, the innermost building on the innermost ring. It was facing us. It had been waiting. The light was flat and even, and it showed me everything. I will describe it now because I can no longer withhold what I saw, and because the description must be complete for the rest of this account to be understood, and because I have carried this image for 58 years, and the weight of it has not diminished by a single grain. It was tall. I am not a reliable judge of height under emotional duress, but I had spent 3 days measuring footprints, grip marks, branch break heights, and peg extraction force estimates. And the accumulated evidence placed the creature at not less than 3 meters standing height. Its body was covered in dark hairs, not the uniform pelt of a bear, but hair of varying length and texture. Longer on the shoulders and forearms, where it hung in matted strands, interwoven with bark fragments and dried moss. Shorter on the broad chest and the face. The face was broad, flat-featured, with a heavy brow ridge that shadowed the eyes and a jaw that projected slightly forward. The brow ridge was scarred old scars, healed white, the kind of scarring that comes from decades of moving through dense canopy at speed. Both eyes were visible in the flat morning light, pale brown, set forward, alert with an intelligence I will not attempt to characterize because every word I could choose would diminish it. It was watching us the way I had been watching the boards, with the attention of someone reading a document they had been waiting a long time to receive. But the hands were what I could not look away from, and they are what I cannot stop seeing when I close my eyes 58 years later in a room in Takayama that is very far from that clearing, and not nearly far enough. They hung at the creature's sides, open, relaxed, curled slightly inward at rest. In the full daylight, I could see them completely. The fingers were long relative to the palm, proportionally longer than a human hand's fingers, articulated at 3 visible joints, each finger as thick as my forearm at the base and tapering to a blunt, dark nail, worn smooth by decades of contact with stone and wood and water and earth. The palms were wide, flat, and bore the calluses of a working life-thickened skin across the heel of the hand and at the base of each finger, distributed in the exact pattern I'd seen on master carpenters and stone masons in Takayama, but scaled to a size that made the comparison feel not grotesque, but clarifying. I was looking at the same hands, the same vocation, the same lifetime of the same work, scaled to a body that could move a boulder the size of a house and choose in the same hour to sand a writing board as smooth as paper. These were the hands that had carved the boards. I knew it the way I knew my own writing, by the width of the grip, by the articulation of the fingers, by the nail geometry that matched the single-stroke carving technique. The creature had not merely enforced the contract, it had written it. It had prepared the boards with its own palms, carved the terms with its own nails, and placed the finished documents in the shrine for human hands to read. For 70 years. And when the human hand stopped reading, it had scratched its grief into the same wood with the same fingers, 1 mark per year, until the silence became unbearable and it came to the door. The creature moved, 1 step forward. A single, deliberate step that covered a distance roughly equal to 3 of my strides, executed with the slow precision of something that understood how its size affected smaller creatures. The ground did not shake. The step was placed, not dropped, the foot set down with the same care the creature applied to everything its body did. One of the samurai behind me, Hayashi, the youngest after me, folded. His legs buckled and he went down on his side in the mud, breathing, blinking, and absent. Not struck, not touched. His proximity threshold had been exceeded. His mind had done what the other 9 minds would do within the hour it had closed, rather than expand to accommodate a scale it could not contain. Ogata raised his torch. The flame was unnecessary, the morning was bright enough to read by, but he held it the way a man holds the last object in his hand when every other object has proven useless. He held it between himself and the creature, and the flame did not waver, because his arm did not waver. And I understood that Ogata's courage, in that moment, was genuine and total and completely irrelevant. The creature looked at the torch. It looked at Ogata. It looked at me. Then it bent, slowly. With a deliberation I have spent 58 years trying to find a word for, and the closest I have come is courtesy. The specific physical consideration of a very large thing, adjusting its movements so that smaller things are not frightened more than they need to be. It bent at the knees and at the waist, lowering its torso toward the ground between us. The motion took a long time. Everything the creature did took a long time, not because it was slow, but because it was thorough. It moved the way calligraphers move, the way master joiners move, with a completeness of intention that made each motion feel like a finished sentence. Its hands, those hands descended to the level of the ground, and they held something. A board. Hinoki cypress. The same length as the shrine boards, the same width, the same chamfered edges. But this board was new. The wood was pale and fragrant, freshly cut and seasoned, the grain tight and even. And the surface was blank. No task entries. No seasonal markers. No completion marks. No scratch marks. Nothing. A clean, sanded, prepared writing surface, sanded by the same palms that had prepared the shrine boards. The grain compression pattern identical, the smoothness identical, the care identical. A board made to be written on. A board waiting for terms. The creature's hand opened. The fingers uncurled from the board's edge one at a time, each finger withdrawing separately, with the individual deliberate release of a craftsman setting down a completed piece he does not wish to damage in the final moment of delivery. The board settled into the mud. The hand pulled back. The creature straightened slowly and stood at its full height, and it waited. The standoff lasted long enough for the light to change. I know this because I was staring at the board on the ground, and the shadow it cast shifted by a distance I estimated at the width of my palm between the moment of placement and the moment the creature stepped back. I do not trust this estimate. Time was not reliable. What I trust is the board, which was there before the shadow moved and was there after the shadow moved and is still there now, in a box in the Tokugawa archive, and has been there for 58 years, and is still blank, and is still warm on days when I cannot explain the warmth. No one moved. No one spoke. Ogata held his torch. Hayashi lay in the mud. The 9 men who were already leaving themselves stood in a line and watched, with eyes that were present and minds that were departing. Ueda stood at my shoulder, breathing calmly, and said nothing, because there was nothing to say that the board had not already said. The creature's eyes moved from me to the board and back, twice. The gesture was unmistakable. I have seen it in every senior official who has ever placed a form on my desk and waited for me to process it. This is for you. Pick it up. Respond. The creature stepped back. 1 step. 2. It turned not hurriedly, not fearfully, with the unhurried rotation of something that has no predators and no peers and no reason to rush any movement it has ever made in its life. And it walked toward the eastern tree line. The canopy received it the way water receives a stone, silently, completely, with only the faintest displacement of branches 30 meters above, to mark its departure. I walked to the board. I knelt in the mud where the creature had knelt. I picked it up. The wood was warm, not the warmth of the overcast morning, the warmth of hands, the warmth of the grip that had held this board while sanding it, preparing it, carrying it through the forest to this clearing. I could feel the pressure memory in the grain, the compression pattern of those palms, identical to the shrine boards, identical to the 70-year record of an intelligence that had been writing work orders and waiting for someone to read them since before my grandfather was born. And the board vibrated. The same subaudible pulse I had felt in the shrine, but stronger and warmer, as though the board were still connected to the body that had made it, by a frequency that traveled through wood the way grief travels through years, attenuated by distance, but never fully gone. I held the blank board, and I understood what had been placed in front of me. Not a weapon, not a gift, not a warning. A contract, an empty contract, prepared by the party of the first part and delivered to the party of the second part, with the terms left blank, because the party of the first part had been writing the terms alone for 70 years, and was now, for the first time, asking the other side to contribute. We descended through the remainder of the 18th and reached the tree line on the morning of the 19th. Of the 12 men who had climbed, 3 walked down under their own volition and behind their own eyes, myself, Ogata, and a man named Tsuda, whose survival I have never been able to explain, except that he had spent the entire expedition in a state of such concentrated terror that his mind had locked itself into a single, narrow channel of function: walk, breathe, follow the man ahead, and that channel, being too small for the creature to fill, had held. Terror, it turns out, can be a structure, a crude one, barely a shelf, but sufficient to bear the weight of one small life walking downhill. The other 9 walked in single file behind us, evenly spaced, matching our pace exactly. They were not restrained. They were not guided by hand or by rope. They moved the way the villagers' footprints had indicated the villagers moved, at a rhythm set by something external, in a compliance that was not coerced but installed. Their eyes were open, their bodies functioned. They responded to direct commands: stop, sit, drink, with the immediate obedience of mechanisms receiving input. But the men who had lived inside those bodies, the men who had held swords and filed tax returns and argued over rice rations on the march up, those men were not present. They had withdrawn. Voluntarily or involuntarily, I cannot say. What I can say is that the 9 men who walked out of the forest on the morning of the 19th were structures without contents, cabinets with the drawers removed. The shelving was intact. The documents were gone. The physicians in Takayama examined all 9 over the following week. They found no injuries, no fever, no swelling, no evidence of poisoning, no dehydration inconsistent with 4 days in the mountains, no visible pathology of any kind. Pupils responsive, reflexes intact, heartbeats normal. The official medical report, which I also transcribed, attributed the condition to exposure and exhaustion consistent with extended mountain patrol in winter conditions. I transcribed this because it was written, and I was the man who transcribed what was written. And what was written was wrong. And the distance between what was written and what had actually happened was the width of a blank board made by hands that no physician in Takayama could have imagined. Ueda parted from us at the tree line. He stopped on the maintained side of the transition, his side, the timber cutter's side, the side where the path was still clear because his family had never stopped doing the work. And he looked at me, and at the board wrapped in cloth under my arm, and he said, "You carry the board. Someone will know what to do with it. Someone always does." He did not explain what he meant. He did not ask to see the board again. He turned and walked south toward the Minamidani Valley, with the rolling, steady gait of a man returning to a life that made sense. And I never saw him again. And I never sent anyone to find him. Because what would I have asked him that he had not already answered in the shrine? On the morning of the 21st, I presented myself at the Takayama District Administrative Office. The official who received me was named Mori. He held the rank of district recorder. He sat behind a desk that held 3 stacks of forms, 2 inkstones, and a cup of tea that was still warm, and he received my written report, the original dispatch scroll, my field inventory notes, the 14 shrine boards, and the blank board. He examined the blank board last. He turned it over twice. He held it up to the window light and squinted at the surface as though expecting to find characters that had been written in a pale ink. He measured its length with a folding rule, 46 centimeters, and its width 12 centimeters, and its thickness 2 centimeters. And he recorded these measurements in the district log in a hand I recognized as standard administrative notation. The same hand I'd been trained to use, the hand that files things. And he wrote beside the measurements: 1 wooden board, unfinished, recovered from site. Provenance unknown. I tried once to explain. I said, "The board is not unfinished. It is unsigned. It was made by—" "I have recorded the object," Mori said. He did not look up from his notation. "That is sufficient." He placed the board in the archive box alongside the shrine boards and my field notes and the dispatch scroll. He sealed the box with the district stamp, a circle of red ink that I had pressed onto 600 documents before that morning, and that I recognized the way a man recognizes his own handwriting, which is to say without feeling and without pride. He wrote on the box lid, "Kaminoda Settlement Investigation, Genroku 12, 11th month. Case closed." He placed the box on a shelf alongside 61 years of Kaminoda tax submissions and the quarterly assessments I had personally copied, and the settlement charter with its original population register. And he turned back to his desk and reached for the next form in his stack and the blank board. The unsigned contract, the open offer, the most important document in the building, went dark. I walked out of the office into the Takayama street. It was a cold morning. The sky was the same flat gray it had been for 6 days. People were moving through the market stalls at the eastern end of the street, and the sound of their commerce, the clatter of wooden sandals, the calling of prices, the laughter of a child being chased between the stalls, reached me across a distance that was not physical. I stood in the street, and I held my hands in front of my face, and I looked at them. They were shaking, not from cold, not from fatigue, from the specific bone-deep vibration that the blank board had left in my palms when I picked it up in the clearing, a resonance that had entered my hands at the moment of contact and settled into the bones and has never fully dissipated. My hands have carried the hum of that board for 58 years. It is fainter now. Some mornings I wake and cannot feel it, and I think it is gone. Then the cold comes, or the mountain air settles into the valley the way it does in late autumn, and the hum returns, and my hands remember the warmth of a grip that was not mine, and I set down my brush and sit with my palms open on my knees until the feeling passes or does not pass. The board is in the archive. It has been there for 58 years. I confirmed this 3 years ago, when my legs still permitted the walk to the district office and my eyes still permitted the reading of shelf labels. The box was on the same shelf. The stamp was unbroken. No one had opened it. No one had read my field notes. No one had examined the shrine boards or traced the carved characters or felt the vibration in the grain. No one had held the blank board and felt the warmth. The most carefully prepared document in the Hida provincial record has been sitting in the dark since the morning I delivered it, addressed to a species that has not yet learned to read it. But the paths are maintained. I discovered this not through the archive, but through my own legs. In the years when I still had the use of them, I walked the ridge road above Kaminoda 4 times between 1710 and 1735. The village was never rebuilt. The clearing remains empty. The shrine still stands maintained, I believe, by hands I do not know and have never sought. But the paths, the eastern route from the Twin Falls to the Split Cedar, the upper channel, the western drainage past the Mossy Stone, are clear. They have been maintained continuously since the spring of 1700, the first spring after our expedition. I walked them. I checked them against the boards I had memorized, every character, every seasonal task, every landmark. The drainage culverts are open and correctly graded. The deadfall is removed. The surface work, the fine gauge path repair, the stone lining maintenance, the channels shaping that the creature's hands were too large to perform correctly, is done. Done by human hands. Small hands. Careful hands. The hands of timber cutters' children and farmers from the lower valleys, and people who live close enough to the mountain to feel in the ground what needs doing when the season turns. No one ordered them. No one showed them the boards. No one explained the arrangement or described the terms or told them about a creature in the upper mountain whose hands are the size of a man's torso and whose patience spans generations. But the work is done. Season after season, year after year. Hands that do not know they are honoring a contract they never signed, maintaining paths they were never assigned, keeping an arrangement alive that no one in the Takayama office has ever acknowledged. And above the tree line, in the terrain that was his before the village, and will be his after the archive, the landlord is doing his part. I have seen the evidence on my walks. Trees moved off upper paths with a precision no human crew could match. Boulders placed in waterways to redirect flow with an engineering knowledge older than the discipline of engineering. Deadfall cleared from slopes too steep for human access. The large-scale work, the work that requires mass, not precision. The same work, the same hands, the same 70-year patience, extended now into its 78th year and counting, by a craftsman who wrote a contract and placed it in the hands of strangers, and is still waiting for someone to write back. 12 men entered the mountains above Kaminoda on the 15th day of the 11th month in the 12th year of Genroku. 3 came back with their minds. 9 came back without. The district record says probable bandit activity. The blank board in the archive says something else. The board was never read. The terms were never signed. The official who filed it did not know what he was holding, and the man who delivered it could not make him understand. And the distance between those two failures is the distance between what the shogunate knew about its own mountains and what the mountains knew about themselves. But the paths are clear. The water runs where the boards say it should run, and the arrangement, which is older than the village, and older than the province, and older than the empire that stamped case closed on a box it never opened, continues. I set the brush down now. My hands are finished. They have held documents for 58 years. Dispatch scrolls, tax ledgers, census forms, quarterly reports written in the correct hand on the correct form with the correct stamp. Accurate in every word, wrong in every meaning. Only one document mattered. It was blank. It was warm. And I was not the one who signed it. Someone did. Someone always does.